Holy crap, it's been 25 years since Donkey Kong Country came out on November 21st, 1994. Now, you probably are all aware of this fact because we've had videos all week in which we've been discussing various things about the game, including interviews with the development staff. So if you somehow missed those, please go check them out. They are super interesting and it's a pleasure to talk with those guys. And they had a lot of insight to provide that I hadn't heard before. It was some truly great stuff there, and you'll find links to it in the description below. So, clearly, we are big fans here of Donkey Kong Country at Game Explained. I grew up with this game. I think most of us did, except for John, who I think at best is just a little kitty John, if you will.
Oh no, don't associate me with that, no.
So this game, stood out for any number of reasons, and I have a whole video either up now or hopefully going up soon about why I think that is. But basically, this game came out and it made a big impact. It looked great, it sounded amazing. It basically took immersion in platforming games, at least, to the next level, I feel like. So we're going to discuss all of this, why we think that it made the impact it did, how the series has continued up to this day, and our general thoughts and impressions of the game both then and now. So let's go and start off with, where we were all at when the game came out and what we remember of this game coming out at the time. So let's go and start off with you, Tom, actually, since we go back the farthest on this, I think, or in terms of personal history. So what was your memory of this game?
So I didn't have a Super Nintendo, but all my friends did, because they were spoiled, I guess. But so it was like maybe better memories of going to friends' houses and playing this game in co-op for hours on end. And at the time, going back to Donkey Kong Country, it kind of like the graphics were mind-blowing in a sense that as a kid I thought like there is like no game can look better than this. This is like reality. It's like they can't do any better. And just how fun it was, like just being a real turning point for Super Nintendo, making it sort of like a definitive step over the Sega Genesis at the time, being a kid like, oh, which one's better, oh, Genesis or Super Nintendo. In my mind, it pushed Super Nintendo over the top.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it looked amazing for its time. How about you, Derek? Where were you at? So you didn't have a Super Nintendo either, so...
Right. I was in a very similar situation to Tom, and I have vivid memories of going to Toys R Us and having all those cards lined up where they showed the covers, and you could grab a little thing and go to the little kiosk and actually get your game. And I would go to the Super Nintendo section, and my eyes would always go to Donkey Kong Country and eventually Donkey Kong Country 2. And I wanted to play this game so much. This was a system seller to me for the Super Nintendo, because I did have a Genesis and I saw Donkey Kong Country. It's like, man, I want this. Man, I want to play this. And my parents just like, you have a Genesis, you don't need a Super Nintendo. Like, no. Fortunately, I did get to play it thanks to a cousin who had a Super Nintendo. And I would go over to his house every so often and just play it, and eventually did beat the game in that version. So I have actually played it back when I was a kid, even though I didn't have an SNES. Otherwise, though, I got my Donkey Kong fix from the Donkey Kong Land game, if anybody remembers that one. Yeah.
I'm sure a lot of people do, but I don't know, or a lot of people experienced it. I don't know if they remember it, I suppose. So
that's kind of how it is to me. Like, I remember it. I remember being still kind of blown away by the graphics on a Game Boy.
No, it was legit impressive, yeah.
But yeah, I didn't get that true country experience.
Yeah, we'll be back in 6 months or so to discuss that game's 25th anniversary. But, all right, how about you, Kitty John? What do you remember of this game?
I don't want this name to stick, and if there's any comments even just referencing this, I'll delete them all. So I had a brief fling as a kid. I think I must have been around 6 years old, and my friend invited me around his house to watch the Sonic OVA, the Sonic movie, and we ended up watching that, and we're staying up for quite a long time in that night. And his dad in his living room had this console I'd never seen before, because I'd never seen a Super Nintendo until that point.
Whoa!
And it was just lying in his entertainment system. And the only game he had was Donkey Kong Country. So we ended up playing that co-op together, and that was the first time I ever touched that game. And I didn't get another experience with Donkey Kong Country until, I think the Wii Virtual Console release. Mm-hmm. And that's when I ended up playing it properly on my own. But much like Derek, I actually had more experience with Donkey Kong Land, because my grandmother had a Game Boy Color. And whenever I went to visit her, I'd play Donkey Kong Land on her Game Boy. So I didn't actually play Donkey Kong Country until probably my teens, so it wasn't really a childhood game.
What was it like visiting it in your teens then? Like, did it still look impressive to you, or did it seem like old news considering there were 3D games out by that point?
No, it was still impressive. I mean, you got to take into account, like, 3D games still kind of looked a bit rough in the Wii era. And Donkey Kong Country had the smoothness to it. Like, the models still look sharper than a lot of 3D games even years later. So sort of seeing like these pre-rendered assets in real time still look stunning on even on the Wii. And yet, till this day, I think Donkey Kong Country has an artistic vibe that very few games can capture.
I would even argue it has a vibe that not even the subsequent DKCs, like the more recent ones, like Returns to Tropical Freeze, quite capture. And I'm not saying that's for the better or worse. It's just the original series does have a different vibe than Retro's versions, I'd say.
I mean, I'd agree. In my opinion, Tropical Freeze looks beautiful. I think that's just a fantastic realization of the art style Returns was going for. But I prefer Rez games visually to Returns.
It had a darker vibe to it. Like, it felt threatening as you were going through because, you know, you start out this nice bright forest, you go through some ruins, that's all nice. And all of a sudden you get into these industrial complexes and tar barrels all over the place. And everything just sort of looks off and corrupted in a way that you never saw from, like, Mario or anything like that. And even being a Genesis kid and playing Sonic, you still didn't get quite that feeling either because it was so much more moody than Sonic ever got, even with its darker areas. So I think that's a really big reason it kind of stuck with you.
You're scary sometimes.
Yeah.
There are legitimately scary moments. Like, there's that level where the lights...
Stop and Go Station?
I think of the other one, but I was thinking of the one where Squawks has a torch, he's lighting the path.
Oh, yeah.
But yeah, Stop and Go Station as well is terrifying. Like, seeing the Kremlings with, like, bright red eyes just sort of shining in the darkness. Yeah, legitimately... And there's no music either. It's just sort of atmospheric ambience, and it's absolutely terrifying.
Yeah, I mean, we discussed this with David Wise, even, how this game really leaned into the atmospheric side of things, whether it's the visuals and the music, and I think both worked in conjunction to really make this game feel, next level. And I think part of the different vibe that we've been discussing is the fact that they were obviously aiming for a more realistic visual style. It's still cartoony to some extent, obviously, but they were definitely trying to make this game look as real as possible, given the hardware constraints and the rendering constraints at the time, which is something I think they've kind of pulled back on, even starting with DKC 3, I'd say. They've gone a little bit more cartoonish sense, and that continued through Tropical Freeze. So yeah, it can't be understated how amazing this game looked at the time. As you were touching on earlier, John, it had a fidelity to it that 3D games couldn't capture, and that's something actually I think it was either Chris Sutherland or Steve Mayles was touching on in our interview with them, where they were saying that when it was first revealed, was actually mistaken, I think at E3 or wherever it was revealed at, it was mistaken for a Nintendo 64 game, which is ironic considering, as they were saying themselves, early 3D games, such as during the 64 era, didn't necessarily look that great, or didn't have that, the level of fidelity that we could see here in Donkey Kong Country. It didn't have this detail, this smoothness. So it is kind of funny that in some ways Donkey Kong Country looked better than subsequent games coming out for years after. And that is what made this game so impressive. Like, I remember, Derek talked about seeing this game in stores, and you couldn't walk past a kiosk without, doing a double take of this game. It looked mind-blowing seeing a game you're playing in real time look this good. As I said earlier on one of our interviews, this was basically the video game version of Toy Story before Toy Story existed. This was a year before Toy Story, and we had a real-time version of it essentially. The reason this all worked, in case you're unfamiliar, is Rare basically had these SGI workstations, which is, I believe, the same technology they used in Hollywood productions such as Terminator 2, and they were able to use that rendering technology and basically output these 3D models as sprites, and then, downscale them to work on the Super Nintendo. So even though under the hood the game was effectively, it's a 2D game, it looked like anything but, and it can't be understated how... I mean, the thing is, if you didn't grow up with this game, or if you weren't around when this game came out, I don't think there's any way to appreciate how good this game looked. I think it still looks good, but you don't know how mind-blowing this was when it came out.
Yeah, it was the talk of everybody. There was so many kids talking about oh my gosh, have you seen the graphics of Donkey Kong Country? Have you played it? And I'm just sitting there no, I need to go to my cousin's and just wanting to experience this because it really was just this massive moment where everybody was talking about it, and I don't remember anything like that really catching on with my friend group or people I knew in school to the same degree until Star Fox 64 back in middle school. And that was a huge thing when everybody's talking about how great the multiplayer was there. But no, Donkey Kong Country was it. Screw Mario. Mario doesn't look good. Yoshi doesn't look good. Donkey Kong was where it's at.
Right, because Donkey Kong Country even preceded Yoshi's Island, which was another great looking game for very different reasons. But Donkey Kong Country was showing, a level of fidelity we had not seen really in any form on the Super Nintendo, I would say.
Right, and this was all on native hardware too. The Genesis used to have the 32X and the Sega CD to try and boost its performance. Whereas this was all just done with just original Super Nintendo hardware with no real special tricks, which makes it even more impressive.
That's actually a great point, considering a ton of Super Nintendo games actually used secondary chips, included on the cartridge itself. The most famous one being, of course, the Super FX chip, but there were tons of others that are less well known by name, but were used in various games, including Nintendo's own, like Palo Wings and Mario Kart. And as far as I know, I don't think Donkey Kong Country used any of those. It is just the pure hardware, which makes it even more impressive. This game is running without any, special hardware at a level we had not seen up to that point at all, including the musical soundtrack that supported these visuals, which was also operating at a level that I think was pretty much unheard of, besides maybe, Red Book audio, obviously, on like PC or any other CD-based platforms. But for like a 16-bit console, it was nuts.
And the thing was, it wasn't just the graphics. I think if it, it could have looked great, and if it played like crap, I don't know if it'd still be remembered, but it really did play just really fun. Finding those secrets, how well hidden they were. Like, you find a tire, like, okay, there's some sort of secret around here. Where is it? What do I need to do? Or I got a Rambi. It's like, okay, there has to be a wall I can break through at some point. Where is it? And I think that's what kept bringing people back to it, is just trying to find those secrets. My cousin be like, hey, check out this cool thing I found, and show me like the barrel that took you all across the stage, across the top, and like skip the whole thing. It's like, that's nuts.
Yeah, the game actually, it kind of took the exploration concept that Mario had dabbled with a bit over its series, and just ran crazy with it, I feel like, because you had the Kong letters, which weren't really a collectible, but you get lives for them. You had the bonus rooms, which contributed to a persistent percentage on the file screen, and I believe Cranky would even challenge you at the end of the game to find all the bonus rooms. Like, he would taunt you if you didn't finish a game, so it provided an extra incentive to go back and find everything. Some of these bonus rooms are deviously hidden, to the point that there was a bonus room within a bonus room, and I hate that one, because that was the one that tripped me up as a kid. I'm like, where is this last bonus? I found them all. Where is it? And I like how that's what contributed to the 101%. You couldn't finish the game or finish everything until you exceeded 100% by finding that final bonus within the bonus. And then, as you also mentioned, Derek, they had those crazy full-level shortcuts, which I think they've leaned even farther into with DKC2, which lets you skip the entire stage. I think one of the minecart, or maybe a stop-and-go station, I think if you just go left at the start, it takes you right to the end, which is awesome. Like, it's such a cool little thing, and something that wasn't commonplace back then. It's not commonplace now, but I think it became more commonplace after this game, so it's something that we didn't think of. You never went left in platforming games.
Another thing, going back to the very first level, is that it does a great job of actually showing you where all these secrets can happen, just kind of automatically, but you running through it with the placement of jumping out of secret rooms and landing on spots to reveal more secrets, or just like getting Rambi and running into a wall right away. Compared to, let's say, the very first Mario level, Donkey Kong Country does a great job in its first level in just teaching you everything that can happen. It'd be really good maybe to examine it further sometime.
Oh, absolutely. I was playing Donkey Kong Country earlier, and the very first level is one thing that I love. If you just go left at the beginning, you can see that your banana hoard is missing. And if you didn't go left into that room, you would never know that context of that.
Kong
I love
text?
the story. God. I love that the story is just sort of optional. And if you don't want to know anything about it, you can just play this game as some monkey. But if you want to get a bit more context, or context as Andre just said, you can. You can just go left and see what's in that room and why you want to sort of go on your adventure. And as Tom was just touching on too, Rambi's in this level. And I love that they just give you so much in the very first level of this game. It really sets the tone for the adventure. And one more thing I love about the first level is right at the end, the sun sets. And even today, you don't see that many side-scrollers with weather systems. And later on in the game, there's the snow level where the snowstorm sort of changes how rapid it is throughout the level. And yeah, you barely ever see that in side-scrollers. It's just an absolutely amazing technical feat.
Yeah, the attention to detail in this game is just mind-blowing for the time. You had the time of day changes, as you mentioned, to the point where it carries across levels, because after it goes to dark in the first level, you're playing in a thunderstorm at night in the second one, before the sun rises again at the end. In the snowstorm you mentioned, you actually see it start up slowly as it gets heavier and heavier, to the point it's pretty much a blinding blizzard. And then there's the fact that every level pretty much begins with a proper entrance and exit. You always enter through a cave or a doorway into a factory, and you exit through a doorway or into a cave. Like, there's a sense of continuity between levels that is something that we hadn't really seen before, even if it is subtle. And as you mentioned, I love the fact that you can go back into the Banana Horde, you can see the context of this whole story. I love how DK just shoots out of his house, showing the urgency of his bananas being stolen. And I even love how it adds some context. I just did by mistake. Some context to the collectibles, because you are trying to get bananas, and you're collecting bananas along the way, which I always assumed were the bananas that the K. Rool and the Kremlings they dropped along the way. And then of course every boss fight takes place within this giant banana horde. So it feels like you're being constantly rewarded with this gradual like earning of breadcrumbs as you make your way to the end. And also, to top it off, as you work your way through the story and through the world map, you see King K. Rool's ship getting progressively closer and closer, presumably to grab the next batch of bananas and bring it back to his homeland. I just love those little details.
Yeah.
Details are the name of the game. Like, Tropical Freeze took this further, but the platforms are baked into the environment, and very few platformers did that in the time. Like, if you think about Mario, most platforms just float. Blocks just float. With Donkey Kong, though, a lot of these platforms are actually part of the environment. So you have like little ridges of landscapes you can jump up on, or even like the minecart rails. They're sort of suspended in the background. Not every platform works like this, but the majority of them do, and it's just such a step towards that realism, which is sort of like a pillar of each part of the game. Like the soundtrack sort of strives for realism, the visuals do, the level design does, and it's just something that you rarely ever see, even today.
Rarely indeed.
Yeah. I also loved how the game just pushed the player to do better each time, mainly through Cranky. How he just always berated you and saying how you could do better and all that. And even I think he was even in the manual. If you read that about the story, he was just like, how could you let this happen? Get out there and do it. If it was me, if I was younger, this would be done already. Get out there and actually do it. And you're like, dang it, old man, I'm going to show you.
Yeah, no, Cranky Kong was a great addition to the game. And in our interview with Greg Mayles, he actually talked a little bit about this and how he wrote a lot of the dialogue for him, including the instruction manual. And Cranky is such an interesting addition for a few reasons, because he provides a context. I keep doing it now. I can't avoid it.
Just stick with it now.
You're stuck with it. Do it.
Man, my brain's just broken from all these puns. But I love how he provides like the explanation for why this world exists in a fourth dimensional way, almost, where he's the original Donkey Kong, and we have this newer Donkey Kong, his grandson, who's basically serving as the new Donkey Kong, but it's technically a different character, even though that's kind of got messed up in the years. Who knows what's going on now? And it was really interesting that in a game that looked this good, in a game that was trying to go for this level of realism, we had a character who was actively breaking the fourth wall constantly. It's like he was speaking to you, the player, which again is something we've seen a lot since. Not a whole lot up until that point, though.
I mean, it is totally 90s tuned, but the whole thing where it's Cranky next to the gramophone playing the old music, and then all of a sudden here comes Donkey Kong, new, hip, kicking out the old guy, sending out the boombox and really dancing. And then, of course, Cranky throws a bomb at him. It really shows that like Cranky's not going to take your crap. He's going to give it back tenfold throughout the entire game. You might be new and hip, but he's going to show you his stuff.
I love that opening. It immediately sets a tone for what this game is. This isn't your grandfather's Donkey Kong. This is a new, young and hip Donkey Kong. And I love, speaking of details, as we were saying earlier, Cranky Kong is actually standing on the top level girder from the original arcade game. It's just so great before it transitions into the jungle.
I love now how the boombox would be the old device.
That's true. It kind of dated itself in that sense.
But one thing, John mentioned minecarts earlier, and I think we can't have this discussion without talking about some of the minecart levels and how, like, for me personally, those were some of the most memorable ones in this game and how tough they were to get through a minecart level. I mean, just how fast-paced they were combined with the music. I mean, those are some of the most amazing levels around at the time when this game came out.
That's amazing timing, Tom. I'm watching a long play of the game right now, and it's actually on the first minecart level at this very moment. So, yeah, these levels to me felt a little bit Sonic-like in the speed they had and how you had to react pretty quickly to things happening. Perhaps a little unfairly quickly at times, which is, thank God for some of those shortcuts you can use to skip at least one of those levels. But no, I agree. The minecart levels are really fun, and again, the attention to detail they had, like with the sparks that would come off from every time you landed in the minecart.
I I remember taking so much time just to figure out the right timing for those jumps, what was coming next. Oh god, I gotta jump over this thing. I never did it in one try, even replaying the game. It was so tough. And of course they had that I think it was the very first minecart level, that last Kremlin coming out before the very end where it just could catch you off guard.
Yep.
And like, dang it, game.
Pretty brutal.
It was probably the most challenging part of the entire game.
But the minecart level is a good example of how often they pull out new ideas. Like every level in Donkey Kong Country feels fresh. Sometimes they sort of reuse an idea, but like put a different spin on it. So there's one minecart level near the beginning, and then there's one near the end as well. And in the second one, instead of you jumping with the minecart, you're actually jumping out of the minecart. So you're sort of like, instead of carrying the same minecart throughout the entire level, you're going from one to the other. And it's that kind of premise where it just sort of spins it a little bit and sort of subverts your expectations. That's just really great. And speaking of that one Kremlin at the end, in the second one, there's a beaver at the end. Like a really harmless beaver. He's not even in a minecart. This is when you're out of the minecart and walking towards the exit of the level. That beaver, who's just sort of walking very slowly towards me, he got me. You never say.
That's awesome.
So, John, you just replayed the game recently, as you said. I played about through half of it for all our coverage this past week. What was it like revisiting it for you? Like, does the game still hold up, do you think? Does it still look good? Or is it starting to show, like, you know, do you think it's starting to show its age? How did the gameplay hold up? What did you think of it overall?
People say video games aren't art, and if art isn't Donkey Kong Country, then art sucks. It looks amazing, it sounds amazing, and a lot of... I think, especially the first half of the game is incredible. I think when it gets towards the end, it does start to get a little bit unfair at times. Like one of the late underwater levels, I think the acidic one, there are fish that sort of come out of nowhere,
Right.
and because the sprites are so big and you have like a 4:3 ratio, it can be a little hard to sometimes judge those smaller little animals coming at you. But I do think the majority of the game holds up extremely well. But if they were to remaster it, I think it would definitely benefit from being in widescreen, just like being able to judge further what's coming at you.
Yeah, that's a good one. Do you think they would ever actually go back and update this game? Because I think the issue, though, with like going widescreen is, and maybe it's been done before, maybe this problem has been solved, but enemy spawn points are based on how close you are to them. So that could kind of change how these levels flow if enemies are spawning because of a wider viewpoint a bit earlier.
Yeah, it could definitely ruin some things. We had the Sonic 1, 2, and CD ported to mobile in widescreen, and they actually benefited the original games really well. So I think if they went back and tinkered a lot of how enemies work, maybe it could work. It does work for the most part though. This 4:3 ratio doesn't break the game. There's just some points where it can be a little bit unfair. And I think even those minecart levels would be a bit more fair if you had a bit more of a chance to react to what's coming at you, especially when you're going so fast. But you know, for the most part though, the game balances itself really well. It's also quite generous with how often it gives you DK barrels. Because we haven't even touched on like the core mechanic, the health system of this game. Basically, there's two different characters you play as, Donkey and Diddy. And if you lose one of them, then you play as the other one. And if you lose the other one, then you lose a life. But it's just the I guess like juggling both characters. They have different attributes. Like Diddy is lighter and faster, whereas Donkey is heavier and more powerful. So Donkey can take out some Kremlings in one hit, whereas Diddy can't. But Diddy's just a bit more agile in the air. So there's always like this risk-reward about who you have. So you want to do well, so that you have like both characters at the same time. You can use both of their benefits, and that kind of makes you play a bit more carefully, I think.
Yeah, Donkey Kong also slaps. Literally, he can slap the ground and find secrets.
I never used that move.
Yeah, I mean, you don't have to. It's only for, like, extra bonuses and whatnot. But it just kind of showed the attention to detail that if you wanted to go back and, like, just really thoroughly explore these environments, you could. I think there were, like, hidden tires you could find at times, or barrels. I think it actually was essential to finding some of the secrets, or some of the, like, bonus rooms even, so...
I remember as a kid being scared to death when I was in some of those darker rooms where they just had thin platforms that you were going across, and you had to jump across a bunch of them, and they'd always have these really small ones with either the sergeant Kremlings or just the heavy lifting Kremlings that Diddy could not kill in one hit. So if I had already lost Donkey and I only have Diddy, I'm like, oh, this guy's gonna knock me right off into the bottomless pit and just have to platform so carefully. It's just like, oh, this is rough.
Yeah, it becomes a bit tense at those moments at times, just trying to get to the next barrel. And let's not forget, too, playing with a friend, joking about grabbing that next barrel, but then just throwing it away or something, or not opening it.
Well, speaking of barrels, too, this game also had those barrel launching sequences, which is something that also is pretty novel and unique to this game, where you have to carefully time when exactly to shoot out of the barrel and its placement when it's moving around in order to not get killed and reach the next barrel. And those sequences are some of the most satisfying to nail if you figure out the timing and, when to shoot yourself. That sounded really bad. With a launch yourself.
Launching through those bees at times, and just how it gets trickier and trickier towards the end of the level, kind of like what Tropical Freeze brought in. That would be pretty rewarding and very tough.
Yeah.
I will admit, during my playthrough just now, I had to abuse the Super Nintendo Classics rewind function, because there was one level where you're going through those barrels and there's like 4 of them in a row which are all just spinning around, and you've got to just nail the timing each one, and it is really tough. I can't remember how I did this without a rewind feature, but it's so tough to get that timing down.
Yeah, it can be.
It's so thrilling though, because you're launching, you're going quick, and especially when they get into those automatic barrels where they really just sort of showing off what they can do and how fast they can go, and then it's like fast. Okay, slow, and you decide when to go. Now, and then another sequence. It had this nice push and pull to the gameplay where it's automatic, but you also take control. And when you do have control, you're like, oh god, I don't want control. Just get me back to solid land. Because towards the end of the game, I think they did have a lot of sequences where basically it was just one long pit and you were just going along barrels.
Yeah.
Yeah, there's even times when they mix the mechanics of the automatic barrels with the manual barrels, and there's a manual barrel that's sort of moving side by side, and there's a automatic barrel on top of it, and you've got to get the timing down so that the manual barrel gets launched into the automatic barrel, and getting that timing down can be really tough. But I love how they just sort of mix all these different layers together.
Well, speaking of different layers, I think that's something too that this game does really well. Is not only does it feature, rendered assets that look amazing, especially for its time, but these levels feel like they have actual depth to them. Like, take the jungle, for instance. I believe there are 6 background layers, and it lends a sense of immensity to this area, to this world, that we didn't see a whole lot, I feel like. Take Mario World, for instance. In its forest, there's like a single background layer, and it barely even looks like trees. Whereas in Donkey Kong Country, like, you can feel the immensity of this jungle, and it really just added to the atmosphere so much. And that goes for other levels too. In the caves, you can see structures that stand between Donkey Kong and the playing field and yourself as well. It makes it feel as if you're down within the caverns and kind of exploring them together.
Just a really nice effect that they always had, and I don't know, it made this seem like this epic adventure that you were going through, and you always kind of appreciated it. Although, it's been a while since I played, so I'm not sure if it's still the case. You and John will know this better. But I do think this game does have a weakness, and that is the bosses. I do think if I remember correctly, most of the bosses are either pretty simple or just not that interesting until K. Rool. I think K. Rool is the best boss by far.
I think you're right. I mean, a lot of these bosses in this game are really simple. The beaver, for instance, is used twice, and he never really gets tougher. At the second instance, he jumps around a bit more, but he's still really easy. And apart from that, they all just go down really quickly without much of a fight.
Which is better, though, than the alternative of it just being a long and grueling boss battle, for in my opinion at least. So I agree they're not great, but they also didn't get in my way of enjoying the game. They weren't too inspired, K. Rool aside.
I have a funny story about K. Rool, so I guess a bit of spoilers for anyone who hasn't played it, but when you fight K. Rool, and it looks like you beat him and credits come up, so my friend and brother were playing it and did this, and they went, oh, we beat the game. Let's go downstairs and get a snack. And then they came up and they saw how Donkey Kong and Diddy Kong were dead.
That's awesome.
And so they had to go back and do it all over again.
And that wasn't an easy boss fight. I mean, at the time, at least, or for me, I remember that being pretty challenging. But who in the heck leaves before the ending? Like, what?
Yeah, they're like, credits, oh, we can go get a snack, we're hungry.
Especially Donkey Kong's ending, because after the real credits roll, it has this amazing sequence where DK and Diddy just screw with each other for like a minute. And I feel like they must have wasted like half their memory just on this little cartoon, essentially. And I love it. Like, I just love that they put it there. It wasn't essential. It's at the end of the game, and yet it's a perfect like final touch to the game, and just added so much added more character to these guys. To this Kong family.
They blew all the budget there. They couldn't animate Cranky Kong because I still remember him zooming around on his rocking chair afterwards.
The real irony is I was looking through, I think, the cutting room floor, and apparently there is an animation in the game, or a cut animation, in which he actually does have a walking animation, but they went with a chair for some reason, so I don't get
It is funny to see him zooming around on that
It
thing,
is
I'll be
pretty funny.
honest.
That's true.
In our interview, actually, I think was it Greg Males who said about King K. Rool's frames being cut. Like, apparently, he used to run at a much better frame rate, but they cut it down because of memory constraints, and because he was one of the last enemies in the game. They didn't think that many people would even see it, so they thought that'd be a fine place to make cuts. So there exists a much better frame version of King K. Rool somewhere.
Yeah, you should definitely, again, watch the interview if you haven't already. It's all super interesting. But yeah, that was interesting. And, when I went back and watched it to find footage for the interview, it's like, okay, I can see that now. But at the time, it didn't really stand out to me. I think because, you're in the moment, you want to beat the game, and you want to beat King K. Rool, and he looked good otherwise. So the fact that he didn't have too many frames didn't stand out. But I would love if they somehow went back and maybe not remade the game, but updated the game to add those frames back in for an HD version. You go back to the original assets, render them out at a little bit higher resolutions, and maybe add the widescreen support you mentioned, John. I think that'd be amazing if they went back and gave a proper update for it. So,
well, the assets are apparently still at Rare. Whether the archives work still, that's another question, but they have them.
I never noticed with the K. Rool the whole lower frame rate thing. Of course, I've always been bad at seeing frame rate, but that herky-jerky motion just kind of works for K. Rool, because, there's a reason people want him back. He's a great villain.
King K. Rool and the Kremlings. The Kremlings haven't appeared in the mainline Donkey Kong game aside from some of the spin-offs and, as cameos in Mario games, such as the goalie and Mario Strikers. So, yeah, I know we're not the only ones. We wanted to see the Kremlings back. I love Tropical Freeze. I loved all those guys. But I would still love if we had a sequel that brought back the Kremlings, brought back King K. Rool in an actual Donkey Kong adventure.
I think Nintendo has to recognize how much love K. Rool has at this point.
Yeah, I think
Thanks
so.
to Smash.
Yeah. I think something else that really, I kind of touched on it earlier, but something else that I think Donkey Kong doesn't get a lot of conscious recognition for is just how immersive it is, between the graphics and the sound and how everything comes together. And one thing that Donkey Kong did that I also don't think was too common at the time is it has no HUD. There is no HUD in this game. The only time there is a slight one is when you grab a collectible and it appears briefly on screen before going away again. And I think it was Greg Males who was talking about how that was a conscious decision. They wanted it so they could really make the artwork pop. And this is something that I don't think we'd see again really too much until, the major thing I'm thinking of is the King Kong games, which famously also didn't have a HUD. They went out of their way to not have a HUD in that game. So what is it about giant apes and not having HUDs?
Kongs hate HUDs.
I guess so, yeah.
Putting them in their natural habitat.
Yeah.
But that's a great point, though. If you could always see your banana count and your life count, not only would it take up a bunch of the screen, but it would also just intrude on the immersion. And I guess you don't really need to see them either. I think when you have one life left, you consciously know you've got to be careful. You don't need to be reminded up in the corner all the time.
Right.
I guess you don't really think about it, which is why it's so impressive.
And that does kind of speak to the brilliance, too, as you mentioned earlier, John, of having the characters themselves act as your health bar, effectively. If you only have Donkey Kong, you only have that one hit left. And I would say that is maybe one of the slight downsides from Retro's trilogy, is that they've stepped away from that. They do have a HUD now, because they have to have that life bar there, because each of the characters has, I believe, 2 heart pieces, or 2 HP points, whatever it is, 2 HPs.
Right.
Mm-hmm. So yeah, that is something that they've kind of stepped away from, for the worse, I would say.
I'd also say there's one mechanic in Retro's games, in Tropical Freeze, that doesn't really have much of a purpose, and that would be that meter that fills up. So I think whenever you have Dixie Kong and Diddy Kong and Cranky Kong, you can pull off a special move with them.
Yeah, it's
and
dumb.
I rarely ever used it.
Yeah, I did either. I felt like I was cheating. I'm like, I'm not a big fan of those mechanics. I'll just ignore it. And actually, something else I would say the original Donkey Kong Country series did, particularly too, better than Retro series. And by the way, we love the Retro games, particularly Tropical Freeze, obviously. That's one of my favorite games of all time, so we're not begging on them. It's interesting to draw comparisons. And I would say Donkey Kong Country, the original trilogy, does bonus rooms better than Retro's does as well. Where in Retro's games, you're always in the same environment, pretty much doing the exact same thing or the same handful of things. Whereas in the Donkey Kong games, there were often quite a few different challenges, if not all unique challenges to some degree, or it felt like it more so than Retro, and they were all in environments that made contextual sense for where you found them.
Most of them are really brief as well, which is in their favor, because you kind of want to get back to the level, you don't want to spend too much time in a bonus room.
Right.
Whereas Retro's ones, most of them take a bit too long, they take longer than you want for a bonus room.
Yeah, you're in there for a good 30 seconds to a minute.
Yeah.
And I guess in Donkey Kong Country, some of them look like they're still part of the environment more, while Retros are definitely more segregated from what the level looks like.
Yeah.
I do it too.
Oh yeah, no, for sure. It just starts to get really repetitive in Retro games, whereas in the original trilogy, it kind of feels like part of the actual level, which I think is why I didn't find them too intrusive, whereas I found them very intrusive in Tropical Freeze, especially, so...
Yeah, I mean, I would go out of my way to avoid them in Retro's games, and I didn't feel like I was missing out because the game was still so strong without them. But in Rare's games, I welcome finding a bonus room.
Right. Yeah, so is there anything else about this game we haven't touched on yet that you guys can think of?
I mean, I haven't played it in years, but did you play the Donkey Kong Land port? Because to me, that was a big deal to get Land on the Game Boy, so I at least had some way to experience this game on my own time.
You're not talking about the port then, you're talking about Donkey Kong Land itself, right?
Yeah, I guess that's true. It's just Land, because that is essentially a different game.
It is. Completely different game. I think only the first world shares the jungle theme, but every level is still completely unique. So yeah, I mean, I enjoyed Donkey Kong Land, and I thought it was incredibly impressive for the time. But it wasn't Donkey Kong Country, right?
Right.
So,
and I remember nothing about that game, to be honest.
But the Game Boy Color did have Donkey Kong Country.
it did.
That's true. I never played those ports, by the way, either on Game Boy Color or Advance.
The port is so interesting because on the one hand, it's incredibly impressive they got it to work at all. On the other hand, it looks so bad compared to the original. Like, they pretty much drop the backgrounds. Like, you only have a single character on the screen. The music is not great. I think they actually reused whichever tracks they could from Donkey Kong Land and then try to get over the rest. But yeah, that is not the way to experience Donkey Kong Country if you want to play Donkey Kong Country.
No, the screen's even smaller too. So it's not just on a smaller screen. They've shrunk how much you can see in your aspect ratio. So the stuff I was going on about near the end, where there's so many smaller enemies, that's going to be even tougher on the Game Boy Color.
It is. Well, I guess we'll know by the time this video goes up. Do you think there's any chance Nintendo will surprise us with a 25th anniversary release of Donkey Kong Country on Nintendo Switch Online?
I hope so.
That'd be a good idea. Is it not part of the Switch Online? I'm so used to it. Wow, that's weird because
I was looking yesterday. I'm like, they got Stunt Race FX, but they don't have Donkey Kong Country.
All right, I don't like where you're going with this, Tom. This line of questioning is hostile.
It would be a really simple thing.
It really would. If they do add it, we've got a stream with the Bad Buddy code on, a multiplayer co-op match with all of us.
Yes, we do. Oh, God, that'd be amazing. And actually, that's something you just posted a video on recently, John, as part of our 25th anniversary. Even the cheat codes are unique in this game, because you would obviously use different button combinations, but they would actually spell out different words depending on which code you were inputting, such as Bad Buddy, as you mentioned, with the D's coming into play with down on the D-pad, as I recall, right? Is that how...
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
That's right, yeah.
Genius. Everything about this game is genius. We haven't touched on the Animal Buddies yet.
Oh man, I mean, yeah, not to rag on Retro's games, because I love Tropical Freeze, and probably more so than some of Rare's games. But that is one area where I would like to see more of.
We only have Rambi.
Games, the Animal Buddies.
Yeah.
It's just Rambi, yeah. Mm-hmm. And they don't even use the Animal Buddies that much in Rare's games, it's just there's more of them. Like, Rambi doesn't get that much screen time because there's all these other Animal Buddies, and they all have different purposes. Like the, what's the frog called?
Winky.
Yeah, Winky, yeah, right. So he's kind of scary because every single time he moves, he does a little jump. And controlling him, he does huge jumps, but if you just want to move a tiny bit, he jumps. So there's always a risk of just jumping off an edge with him. But he also has a much better jump ability than your standard jump. So I love just how they have this sort of risk-reward factor to all the Animal Buddies.
Yeah, the Animal Buddies were basically the Yoshi in this game, except there were more of them. There were 4 Animal Buddies, if I remember correctly, or 5, I think, if you count Squawks. and they all felt unique, and that was kind of cool. Like, it took the idea of Yoshi and expanded it beyond what Mario World did, although it did lack the ability to take them between levels. And I guess I can already see the comments. Yes, I know there are different colored Yoshis, but besides their like one unique ability, they were the exact same. So
yeah. That said, I as a kid, I did love Rambi the most because it was just fun powering through everything and just destroying everything in your path. I mean, I think that's why I loved On Guard as well, because hey, you get to do the same thing just in the water.
Yeah, On Guard was very close to a water equivalent of Rambi, and just when I would lose him, it'd be like sort of that terror,
You'd chase
panic,
him.
and just racing back to try to get him as quick as possible because he's on the map still.
doesn't Rambi do that, like that terrified face too in the sound whenever he gets hit? He's like, oh, and then runs off. So great. Oh man, I going back to this game is always a treat. Like, it just still looks impressive to me to this day, including things like the title screen or going to Cranky's cabin. I think Cranky's cabin for me might be one of the most impressive looking parts of the game. It just looks so real and so good. Seeing this whole, like, you know, his cabin and his house and all the detail in it, I just love it.
Actually, speaking of Cranky, how do you guys feel about the other Kongs we got introduced to, Funky and Candy?
Candy is something from hell. But Funky, though, Funky has stood the test of time. People love Funky today. I think he was the most popular character in Mario Kart Wii. He became a playable character in Tropical Freeze for the Switch. I think people just love Funky Kong, but when was Candy Kong's last appearance?
2 recently. However long ago it was.
Yeah, I think I read somewhere that she was supposed to be playable in the Donkey Kong Pilot game, but you know that got scrapped and became Banjo Pilot. I feel like she's popped up since the country games, but I've mostly the spin-offs and just in sort of like advisory roles. But yeah, she's scary.
Yeah.
Like, it's like, okay, who thought it was a good idea to make a sexy monkey?
It's not just that, like, she stands like a human as well, whereas
Yeah,
Donkey
true.
Kong clearly doesn't. It's so strange.
Yeah.
And no other Kong stands like she does.
Going through some of the old renders of the games, you see everyone like maybe half as tall as the image, and then there's Candy Kong, and she's like towering above everybody.
Yeah. She's pretty
Yeah.
tall.
That's why people like Dixie more.
Donkey Kong Country 2 introduced quite a few new Kongs too, so I am looking forward to discussing all of that next year
Yeah.
for its 25th anniversary. So
Well, the soundtrack, we haven't really talked about it enough, I don't
That's a
think.
good point.
The soundtrack
Actually,
is
that's a good point.
just incredible. When you think back to other platformers, they were just all so happy sounding. And can you imagine that kind of soundtrack in this game? Like, imagine Aquatic Ambience with something different. Like, imagine that was just a jolly, happy video game tune. It would ruin the level. And it's pretty daring to do that kind of thing at the time. And it would go beyond that too. Like, some levels wouldn't really have music, and it would just be ambience. So I think, like, if Donkey Kong Country didn't try that, I wonder, would scores be different in video games today?
Huh. Yeah, that's a good question.
sure.
Yeah, maybe, but I still feel like Donkey Kong Country still stands out pretty uniquely for how it incorporates environmental sounds into the music. Even the first level, for instance, like when you play a Mario game, the first level like hits you over the head immediately with, you know, its music. And I'm not saying it's a bad thing. I love Mario songs too. But Donkey Kong Country, take its first level, like you hear birds chirping, and then you hear like this quiet drum beat get louder and louder before the song eventually kicks in like 30 seconds later. So Donkey Kong Country isn't afraid to take his time and set the mood before it gets into the music itself. It does so partially by incorporating different sound effects into the music, whether it's a dripping of water in like the caves, or you can hear like creaking floorboards in the mines, I think, or the walkway levels. It's just like some genius stuff going on here.
To me, this is very reminiscent of when people think back to Mario 64. Like, just the opening and hearing the moat, hearing the water, hearing the birds chirping.
Yeah.
I do wonder, would they have gone in that direction if Donkey Kong Country hadn't first sort of made that standard?
I'm sure it had some level of influence, because we know Miyamoto obviously was aware of Donkey Kong Country, of course. But interestingly, this is the first Donkey Kong game that he wasn't directly responsible for, in that he didn't direct it, he didn't produce it. But I'm sure he, you know, had some level of involvement though in just making sure they didn't ruin Donkey Kong. But yeah, I wouldn't be surprised at all if Nintendo were inspired by what Donkey Kong did in terms of like presenting a believable world.
Yeah, you get a little bit of Koji Kongo in there.
Nice. But yeah, I mean, the music here is just, I mean, I don't think we can say enough to praise it. We had a whole interview with David Wise about it, but we should mention too, David Wise wasn't the sole composer on this game. It was also, I believe, Evelyn Fisher, and I think who had a few tracks, and then Robin Beanland, I believe, was a third, who I think did the Funky Kong song. And all the music, like, I mean, I can't listen to this game and discern who did what without looking up a playlist, and that is a testament to how good the music is. There is no weak point to the songs here. They all sound at equal level, which is extremely impressive. So these are the people like working at some of the top of their game, I would say, in just making a world and bringing it to life. And that's something I would say there's probably a slight shift on in Donkey Kong Country 2. Like, not a huge shift, like it still provides immersion, but I think Donkey Kong Country 2 definitely went for a little bit more of a game-like atmosphere overall, whereas Donkey Kong Country 1 felt like it was definitely trying to make it seem a little bit more realistic, I think, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
I think to the music of Donkey Kong, and of course you got some real memorable pieces in there, but a lot of the times it just think of those ambient sounds, and you know, that's sort of what I associate with Donkey Kong.
And the terrifying patter of like Naughty and one of those rolling logs, hearing that coming.
The wonderful crumbling every time you take one out.
Oh yeah, it's the same sound as Rambi.
Yeah.
All right, guys, anything else?
Well, I would just say if you have not played Donkey Kong Country ever, if it ever comes up to Switch or you have a Super Nintendo Classic or something, make sure you check it out. It still holds up today, maybe a bit tougher than some games are these days, but that's
what
just make sure
the
you play.
rewind feature is for.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. And if you still don't play it, then you are banned from games.
Yeah.
I really hope, I mean, I really wish Nintendo had done, I'm assuming they haven't by this point, but I really wish Nintendo had done something for the anniversary. If they have, I'm going to look like a jackass right now. But yeah, like, this is a huge anniversary, I feel like. This is a major game. Like, actually, something we haven't even really touched on is the fact that this basically kind of, I feel like, extended the Super NES's lifespan, and maybe was crucial in the console war against Sega Genesis, in that Nintendo had a game they could point to, and it's like, look at this. This is something you can't get on any other platform, and in the ads even, it's like, this isn't the Sega Saturn, this ain't PlayStation, if I remember correctly. This is on Super Nintendo. And again, I can't convey enough how it's impossible to appreciate that nowadays. You can't, I don't think it's possible objectively to look at this game now if you didn't grow up in the era and appreciate what this game looked like at its time. And that goes for, you know, I'm sure any number of games as well. But this game especially was just mind-blowing back then. And that's a feeling I don't think it can be captured again, period.
We touched upon this a little bit earlier, but like Sega were sort of sabotaging themselves because the Sega CD, the 32X, and the Saturn all came out within a fairly short time of each other. But Donkey Kong Country is just a Super Nintendo game. So for them to like get this sort of performance out of the Super Nintendo without making their consumers buy all this different hardware and confusing them about what the next generation is and what isn't, that definitely helped the Super Nintendo.
Like I said, I had a Genesis. I wanted the Super Nintendo, mainly because of Donkey Kong Country.
Yeah. And then the following year, we had a sequel to the game, which somehow looked even better.
Yeah, that was killing me too. Especially because I'd play those kiosks and play Dixie and like, she's so fun. She floats. That's awesome.
How nuts is it, though, that these games were made in a year span? I believe they said the first game was done in a year, and then the sequel was done in a year. How do they manage that?
It's just unbelievable. And I guess 15-hour days, like the Stampers were working, as they were mentioning in one of the interviews.
Yeah.
Oh yeah, I'm sure there was no work-life balance back then.
No. It just reminds me of Insomniac with the Ratchet and Clank releases. It's insane.
And the first game, too, I believe, only had a staff of about 20 people at its peak time, which is nothing compared to games these days. So yeah, the whole thing is wild. Like, this really did just show us like what video games could look like in the years from then. Like, it kind of offered like a peek at a far distant future of video games that wouldn't be realistically attained for probably 2 generations later. So in real time at least. Which is pretty cool. Like, how often does that happen?
Yeah, seriously.
Like as Greg Mayles mentioned, like the characters even self-shadow in the game. Of course, that's not in real time; it's all pre-rendered. But it's something that wouldn't become commonplace until years later. And he was saying even these days, or it might be Steve Mayles, I forget one of them, or maybe Chris Sutherland, one of the people we interviewed. He was saying that's even something that they struggle with these days in making it look good. There's always some compromise in how crisp it is and how accurate. But here we have in Donkey Kong Country looking amazing again on Super Nintendo. So. But anyways, I would love if they went back and updated these games. But I don't know, maybe we'll lose some of the charm too.
It's possible.
Yeah. All right, guys, I'm gonna say it one more time. Any final thoughts, all? Any final wrap-up things you wanna throw out there about Donkey Kong Country?
My last words are David Wise.
You're a wise man.
Yep, that's pretty great.
No, it's just, they're fun. It just simply comes down to it's a lot of fun.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's something maybe we didn't even touch on enough. Like, I know you did earlier, Derek, but these games aren't just good-looking. There were plenty of good-looking games, but they were often shallow and didn't have gameplay to back it up. Donkey Kong did. No, it did, it wasn't perfect. There were some, weird hit detection issues at times, for instance. But on the whole, this was an extremely solid game that looked amazing, that sounded amazing, and offered a level of immersion that we hadn't seen. So it was easier to overlook some of its shortcomings in favor of the things it did well, because the things it did well, it just did better than anything else at the time. And that's why it's held up 25 years later and why we're still talking about it and why it's had this legacy where people are still playing games in the series today. And that's something that's, I think, super cool.
I'll also point out with the overworld map, you kind of got that Kong Island, and it's sort of set the scale for like where you are in the quest and how it's like a grand adventure and like moving up the island as it went on. That was really good.
Yeah. And he eventually ended up on the pirate ship at the end.
Yeah.
Which naturally leads into the pirate theme of Donkey Kong Country 2. It's also genius, and it had that amazing pun being Conquest. So I can't wait to talk about that game next year. All right, I think we're about done here. So thank you so much for watching, guys. Hopefully you enjoyed our 25th anniversary coverage of Donkey Kong Country. If you haven't checked it all out, please do. We have tons of great interviews with developers where they cover far more than we touched on here. There's definitely some super interesting stuff that I don't think is commonly known. I think some of it hasn't even been reported before. So please check it out. There are links to all that in the description below. Otherwise, of course, stay tuned to Game Display for tons more on Donkey Kong in the future. I'm sure we'll be back next year, as I said earlier, and subsequent years for more anniversaries and everything else Nintendo as well. We'll catch you later. Bye.